So I thought I would, before I start the lecture formally, just alert you to what's coming up. So next week there is, if you've checked UIS, you know there's no lecture. And we'll be, but there will be a seminar on Friday. We'll have a seminar this Friday, we'll have a seminar next Friday. One of the reasons for that is to give you a little bit more time and opportunity to think about basically the midterm assignment or exam that's coming up. It will cover all the materials we've looked at so far, but there'll be nothing new beyond what we've done. And the midterm will be in the format really of I'll be sending you posting specifications, but giving you a chance to start thinking about it already now. It will be a bunch of quotations from the text we've looked at so far, of the style that we've looked at, and you'll be asked to kind of identify them. This is take home. You'll have a chance to, but the main thing to do will be to try to use some of those citations to answer a question. So it'll be a little bit like an essay question, but not a very big one that will concern the big themes, tying themes, and texts. But you'll get more specific instructions on that in the next few days. And that will be then ultimately due after our not the discussion this week, but after the discussion next week, probably by Monday. But I'll be posting it in the next few days. But let's get started with today's lecture. This is a lecture that I'm always excited to give, and unfortunately, I had to leave it out of last year's version of this course. But in some ways, it's I think, the lecture that brings things together best, and maybe helps you see how the place we're living in, the texts we're looking at, really resonate with the larger themes we're talking about. There are three authors at the center of this: George Orwell, Tanya Alexander, Sigmund Freud. And these will be, of course, the basis for your posting this week and the basis for our discussion next week. They're all three important figures of the 1920s and the 1930s. And I think through them we can see some of the contradictory and controversial dynamics of Europe and Russia in this period. The title of the lecture I've given you is Defamiliarizing Modernity, Europe as Battlefield or Refuge. And in it, I want to look at how the very question of modernity that we've been looking at all along, how the world is supposed to be changed, made better, faster, runs up against its most significant, you could say, critics in the 1920s and 30s. And the very aspiration to change the world to its core, to create a new civilization, to make a better humanity, a better society, encounters the question, is it all worthwhile? Should we really be doing this? It's a question that lingers with us to this day, but I think it's the 1920s and 30s that it gets its first most articulate formulation. And in many ways, Orwell, Tanya Alexander, and Sigmund Freud help us to pose that question to modernity. So each of the sections of today's lecture, and I have three, they're all quite involved and lengthy, but each one really focuses on one of these individuals. We'll start with civilization and its discontents with Freud, and the question of the other within. Next, we'll move on to the problem of modernity in Catalonia, where the Spanish Civil War erupted in the 1930s, and the battlefield for modernity's chosen people, as I put it. Because one of the things that we have found since 1848 is this problem of defining the people. Who are the people who are supposed to carry society into the future? And each ideology has its own version of who those people are, whether they're the proletariat, whether they're the bourgeoisie, whether they're a national group. Of course, we get the language of the chosen people from the Bible itself. The Jews are the original chosen people, you might say, of biblical times. But in some sense, modernity becomes Jewish insofar as everybody starts to think of themselves as the chosen people and trying to imagine a future in which a certain group of people are more virtuous, are better somehow at moving the world forward into the future. In the last section of today's lecture, we'll look at Tanya Alexander, the child of a Baltic German count and a Ukrainian aristocrat who came to live in Estonia after the Russian Revolution, when basically her family had no place to go. And with this, we'll also look at the people who are left behind by modernity, the people who acquire the title or description as former people. This is actually the title of a short story written by the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, Former People, and it became a common way of describing the people left behind by the revolution by Stalin in the 1930s. But I want to begin with the key word of the title, defamiliarization. Modern art and modernism in European art started to take hold in the 1860s and 70s with pictures like this. This was an age in which realistic depictions of the world became increasingly, you could say, unimportant became increasingly marginal. The idea of using art to challenge our way of seeing the world, to see the world in a new way, begins in some ways, it goes back even a little bit further, with the Impressionists and Monet. But by the time you get to Kandinsky and Dali, the notion that art is supposed to reflect reality is really not an important part anymore of the modernist experiment. The task of art is to challenge us to see in new ways. And the person who gives the definition of what art in general is supposed to do and what modernist art in specific is supposed to do most clearly, and applies it not only to paintings and to the visual arts, but also to literature, is the Russian formalist writer and thinker Viktor Shklovsky in his essay of 1917, Art as Technique. It's he who coins the word defamiliarization. In one word, he says, this is the purpose of art. The purpose of art is defamiliarization. It's to take what we think we know and turn it into something we don't know. To take what is familiar and make it foreign. Because this is such an important idea, and we'll be applying this idea now not just to art, but to economics, to politics, and to society at large. In the next 3 sections of this lecture, I want to just linger for a moment over the passage in his essay of 1917, of course, the year of the Russian Revolution, you might note, where he, in fact, develops this idea and this definition. It comes, he comes upon it, or you could say he starts to work this out interpreting the writings of Tolstoy, the great Russian writer. And he takes on famous novels like Anna Karenina, but he also takes on this little, well, at least in the Western world, little-known short story, Holodomor, or The Story of a Horse, which Tolstoy had written in 1863. And he starts quoting Tolstoy. What Tolstoy writes in this story is this. And he's writing this, I would remind you, from the perspective of a horse. The horse is imagining the world. What's the meaning of his colt? From these phrases I saw the people thought there was some sort of connection between me and the stable. At the time, I simply could not understand the connection. Only much later, when they separated me from the other horses, did I begin to understand. But even then, I simply could not see what it meant when they called me man's property. The words my horse referred to me, a living horse, and seemed as strange to me as the words my land, my air, my water. So this is just the passage from Tolstoy. But you see what Tolstoy is doing, or rather what Shklovsky is calling attention to here. What happens when we start to look at the world through the eyes of a horse? Of course, we don't know if this is what the horse actually saw, but in the imaginative world of Tolstoy, and in the imaginative world of Shklovsky interpreting Tolstoy, what do we see about the world through the eyes of the horse that we don't see about the world through the eyes of a human being? He's trying to conceptualize the outsider, or he's trying to conceptualize the outside, something about the world that he's or is he trying to conceptualize human beings from? Or?
Trying to conceptualize more specifically this human concept of ownership, of ownership actually means to own something from the perspective of a horse, where they don't have that concept of owning that from a young age.
Okay, great. So let's put these two comments together. Yes, he's trying to see, I think, humanity from the outside, and exactly, he's trying to sort of conceptualize or try to describe the idea of property from the perspective of someone for whom property doesn't mean anything. But in the process, he forces us as human beings to question what we think we know about property too. My book, my table, my pen, what does it mean to own anything? This is what defamiliarization is all about. Taking something that you use in your everyday life that you think you know, because it's so common that you never even think twice about it, and forcing you to see it from a different perspective, and then realizing that you actually don't know anything about it at all, or that the thing you thought you knew was much more complicated, much more difficult, much more problematic than you ever imagined it to be in the first place. Shklovsky takes this idea from these passages in Tolstoy. In this case, I think it's important, as Cameron points out, that he's talking about a political or a political economic concept, the idea of property. In fact, there's already in literature here, there's an economic claim being made about what does it mean to own property. Of course, this becomes a very important theme in the Russian Revolution, becomes a very important theme in thinking about a future world. What is the nature of property? Who owns what? How do we decide who owns what? This tendency, or this emphasis on the idea of art as making things strange, flourishes over the course of the next decade or two, and perhaps achieves its culmination in maybe the most famous painting of the interwar period, certainly the most famous war painting ever painted, Picasso's Guernica. Painted in June 1937, commissioned by the Spanish Republicans. And since the Spanish Civil War is one of our themes for today, I thought this would be another good image with which to get us going. We shouldn't forget that this is a painting that, for many people, you could say, expresses the horror of war. You can see that horse. There's a horse here as well, right? Kind of roaring in pain and suffering. But it's also, importantly, a work of propaganda. It was painted in 1937, commissioned by a political group, the Spanish Republicans, to show how horrible the fascists are. Of course, the bombing of the Basque village of Guernica had happened just a few months earlier. The Nazi and fascist planes that had bombed it, this had been commissioned by the Spanish nationalists. Each of these, you could say, was an act of one of art or propaganda, and the other of military violence and aggression. But it speaks to the polarized atmosphere of the period and the age, in which people increasingly come to see one another not as worthy adversaries or members of a loyal opposition, but as fundamental enemies and deeply evil. This painting, exhibited at the Paris World's Fair, November 1937, you could say crystallizes for us the problem and the theme of barbarism and civilization, and of modernity, and where it's taking us. We see in it the polarization of Europe, the end of the idea of a loyal opposition, a world, that is to say, where you have different political parties who are all valid, representing different points of view, and the birth of a world in which we have people who have to be eliminated, who have to be removed in order that we can restore a kind of civilization that we are truly can believe in. The technique that Picasso uses here, of course, is defamiliarization, taking something that images of people, of animals, and showing them in a way and in a light that makes us see them as if for the first time, and as fundamentally and profoundly strange. Now, what I want to do with the rest of this lecture, as we move through the 3 points here now, is talk about how this problem or idea of defamiliarization applies to various arenas of European economic, political, cultural life in the 1930s in particular, and in the interwar period more generally. And I want to start with defamiliarizing development, one of the great themes of modernity that we've been looking at all along. And with it, you could say the ideal or the principle of homo economicus, the rational thinking individual who is supposed to be able to make decisions for him or herself, and whose rationality should be the basis of our new improved modern civilization. Development, you might say, is the most fundamental of the themes that we've been looking at in connection with modernity so far. And nobody, I think, calls it more profoundly into question than the great psychologist Sigmund Freud himself in his last work, Civilization and Its Discontents. And he does it by calling our attention to something that perhaps has escaped our notice so far in all of our talk about others and selves, that there is an other within, that the greatest enemy and the greatest foreigner might be the person who exists inside ourselves. Now, to get this in a slightly larger context, I want to talk first about economics before we get to the rational human individual as Freud treats him, and to kind of alert you to the defamiliarized nature of economic and social life in the 1920s and 30s. I think it would suffice to quote from Sholem, the Polish Jewish writer, who talks about how strange it was to live in that era. It was as if someone had picked up the world and shaken it into utter confusion. There were no permanent values. What were paper or diamonds, gold, houses or factories? A transient illusion, a fleeting gleam, a dissolving fantasy. With the economic crash of 1929, the Great Depression in America and the economic, you could say, the economic crisis that spread throughout Europe, money lost its value. Money, in some sense, was defamiliarized. It lost its clear connection to meaning. It did so in some places even earlier, right after the war. But the notion of what has value became a major question of the interwar period, and certainly of the 1930s, once the crisis hit. The crisis of capitalism hits interwar Europe, 1929, 1930, 1940, and there is a wide perception after World War I, and this is in some sense what Keynes was predicting in the economic consequences of the peace, was the failure of international capitalism with the war guilt clause that had made Germany bear the responsibility for the war effort. And it takes a little while, but it isn't really till the 1930s that it spreads across Europe. The League of Nations has set as one of its agendas the financial reconstruction of Europe. And in 1926, it does seem, or Keynes seems to declare, seems confident in declaring, the end of laissez-faire. It says the end of this kind of internationalist capitalism that we've believed in the 19th century has come. We don't need to worry about it anymore in the future. And in 1929, in fact, when global capitalism does in fact collapse, there is a widespread sense that many of the things we thought we knew about the way economics works, trade works, have to be called into question. This is the defamiliarization of the economic foundations of modern civilization, and certainly the modern promise of development, because development requires finance. The development requires it requires investment. Development requires the ability to count on people to make contracts and follow them through. And all of that seems to be falling apart before our very eyes. Keynes maybe is most famous as kind of the father of the welfare state, like the person who decides or works out an economic system to help pull Europe out of this crisis. And the key to doing this is recognizing the appropriate relationship between the national and the international. He writes at one point, and this is cited by the historian Mark Mazauer, that some things are appropriately international. Ideas, knowledge, science, hospitality, travel, these are the things which should be of their nature international. But let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonable and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national. One way to fix the crisis of Europe, or to deal with it at least, is to start producing for local national communities more. That the trade situation that got us into this mess in the first place is not a sustainable one. That somehow we have to reconfigure our vision of what ought to be international and national in the making of the world. A same kind of, you could say, divide comes to the world of socialism. And Mazauer writes about this in his book as well, when he notes that communism began to emerge as a radical national alternative to international capitalism. This is all very confused, and I don't want to get bogged down in the details of the internationalist versus nationalist claims of both capitalism and socialism. But I think it's important to point out one figure who we are shortly going to leave behind because he leaves the Soviet Union, and that is Leon Trotsky. And if capitalism was defamiliarized in the 1920s and 30s by Keynes and by the reinterpretation of what to do in a situation, in a predicament of crisis, Trotsky helps us, or helped the world, to defamiliarize socialism, to force people to question what they thought they knew about socialism. Trotsky, in many ways, you could say, was a Marxist fundamentalist. He believed that the Soviet Union had taken the Soviet Union in the wrong path, but that there was a version of Marxism that could have made socialism work. I'll just remind you of the context here. In 1917, the Soviet Union was founded and proclaimed itself capital of the Third International. That is the common term, the organization of communist parties around the world, with their capital or with their key building, now in Petrograd, later Leningrad, and that the Soviet Union would preside over the global movement to create socialism and communism. Trotsky was himself expelled from the Comintern by Stalin in 1927. 2 years later, he was exiled from the Soviet Union, and in the next decade, in exile, living in Mexico, among other places, he wrote his most famous critique of the Soviet experiment, The Revolution Betrayed, where he called Stalinism, with references back to 1848 and to the French Revolution, Bonapartism. He said Stalin had taken the revolution in the wrong direction, especially by his policy of stressing and focusing on socialism in one country. That the true version of socialism had to remain internationalist. It can't be focused on any one country. And in fact, shortly before his death, because he's famous also for his affair with Frida Kahlo, the artist, the painter, in Mexico, and ultimately for his assassination by Ramon Mercader, a soldier of the Spanish Civil War, who, upon Stalin's behest, ends up assassinating Trotsky, and it seems like everybody seems to know, with an ice pick at his home in Mexico. But along the way, Trotsky founds the Fourth International, which becomes this kind of thorn in the side of the Third International. And it's a good reminder that Europe is confused throughout the 1920s and 30s about what socialism really is. The Stalinism and the Stalinist version of it, the Third International, represent what socialism is all about? Or is it really Trotsky's version of the Fourth International, founded in Paris in 1938? How international or nationalist should it really be? So what I've done so far in this lecture for you today is just point out two ways, or in this section of the lecture rather, of how economic ideal of development gets defamiliarized by the events of 1920s and 30s. How capitalism itself gets called into question. Keynes is one of those defamiliarizers. And how in the Soviet Union, or rather in the socialist world, the idea of what socialism really is also called into question with the existence of competing versions of it, the Third International versus the Fourth International. And this is an important divide because it actually divides a lot of Europeans among themselves, even socialists. But if we dig a little bit deeper beneath the economic surface, we eventually get, I think, to the problem of the human individual and the defamiliarization of the human individual that is wrought and brought about by the psychologist Sigmund Freud. Now, I have included here on the right side of the screen just a list of some of the terms that Freud coins and have become, for the most part, parts of our everyday, at least language of therapy, but even maybe our language of everyday life. Words like psychoanalysis, repression, denial. Denial is a very common word, but Freud really makes it happen. Catharsis, neuroses, projection, the Freudian slip, the Oedipus complex, the pleasure principle, the death instinct, and maybe most interestingly and important for our purposes, sublimation. Does anybody know, sublimation is key to Freud's argument in the Civilization and Its Discontents. Anybody want to take a stab at what sublimation means? I do this simply because I think it's easier to remember if you try to formulate it yourself first.
It's when people analyze their emotions into other things, like, for example, war is like a sublimation of hate. So you kind of try to get it from inside to outside. That's something.
Basically, and for our purposes, I think that's very good. And there's a more specific, perhaps, and more precise way of putting it. But the basic idea that I'm interested in, and I think that you managed to express very well, is the transformation or transfer of a feeling or an emotion into an activity that takes its place. The problem with sublimation, of course, is that it means that something gets transformed but also repressed in the process. And this is the key to the answer of why are people unhappy and why does civilization suffer discontents. Just a few words on Freud's background so we can remember who he is and where he comes from, because he's already entered our story earlier. And if you look at his dates, 1856 to 1939, you see he's basically a child of 1848. I mean, he's one of these people who's born in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848. He grows up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's very much a citizen of that world, and as well as a citizen of the larger world. He's a very successful, you could say, assimilated German-Jewish scholar of the period. Becomes a doctor of medicine from the University of Vienna. And I want to introduce you to his theory in a very basic way, because I think there are really just two things for our purposes that are important to know about him and to remember about him. And the big idea behind these two things is that the human beings we see in everyday life are only the tip of the iceberg, or that what we see about human life in everyday life is only the tip of the iceberg. The human psyche, our mind, our experience is much bigger and more extensive than what we encounter. And that in order to truly know who people are and what is going on in the world, you have to dig beneath the surface. This revelation, so the basic idea, I think, guiding Freud all throughout is this idea that human beings consist of a superficial self that they present to the world, a rational self, the self that modernity is in love with. But the true self, the real self, is everything that lies beneath. And this is what we see at the surface. Again, the iceberg metaphor works very well for Freud, because icebergs too. You see a bit of ice at the top, but you have this island or world beneath the surface of the sea. This begins, you could say, or he becomes kind of a household name in Europe after 1899 with his first great book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And what he offers us in The Interpretation of Dreams is a way of thinking about dreams. The dreams people have are not random. They're access to that deep, underlying part of our psyche that we don't encounter in everyday life. And if we can interpret dreams, we can understand what's really going on inside people. In this book, he basically offers his first model of the human psyche. He says it's a two-part model. We have the conscious mind and we have the unconscious mind. And making people healthy, healing them, making them able to cope with their lives is all about giving the conscious mind access to the unconscious part. The task of psychology, in some sense, is this, to open our conscious mind to the things that are suppressed and lying beneath. In the 1920s, after World War I, this vision of the human psyche evolves, and it becomes a little bit more complicated. And a lot of people ask about Freud. Well, how do we get this two-part psyche to the three-part? None of that, the specifics don't really matter so much. What matters, I think, for our purposes here, is that there's always something on the surface and there's always something below. And in the 1920s, when he starts to work towards a slightly more complicated vision of the mind, we end up with the most famous tripartite vision of the ego, the superego, and the id. Now, the ego is the part, again, that modernity is in love with. Modernity loves the ego. The ego is the rational self that makes decisions, that knows what it's doing, that makes choices on the basis of its own self-interest, and maybe the self-interest of the larger society around it. But the ego is not all there is. There's also the social context in which you live. And this is how it becomes complicated. The superego is all that pressure, all those points of view and ideas that come from society around us that tell us we should behave in a different way, that tell us that we should perhaps act according to the norms of society rather than to the interests of the ego. But it's not just the norms of society that are influencing us and our own rational self. There's also ultimately, at the deepest level, the deepest subterranean level inside us, the id. That instinctual, animal, emotional self or core, kind of associated with the unconscious mind, that is motivating us to do things and to act in ways that both our rational ego and the larger social context or superego are trying to stop us from doing. Taking our clothes off in public, running naked through the streets, shouting at everybody whenever we're slightly upset with them. This is all the kinds of things that might happen, says Freud, in the animal kingdom when we don't have the inhibitions of the superego and we don't have the vision of a rational ego guiding us towards goals and objectives. Now, you could say this work on the psyche comes to its culmination in this 1929 work that we'll be reading for this week and for next week too, right? Civilization and its discontents. And I would put to you the central question is why are we still not happy? And it's this question that I think makes this book, or this work, maybe the most important book of the course, and the most important book for looking at and investigating modernity. If you remember, the promise of modernity is the promise of a transformed humanity, human nature, human society, where we can become the subjects and the objects of our own development, where we can make choices for ourselves that benefit ourselves and benefit everybody around us, where the world will be better for everyone. And Freud is essentially asking, why, after 150 years of trying to do this, have we still failed? Why did the French Revolution not take us there? Why did the Revolution of 1848 not take us there? Why did all the uprisings in the name of a better society, why did all the reforms and all the political parties and all the attempts to make people politically active and agents in their own lives, why are we still struggling to achieve this goal, an objective? And the simple answer, I think, and when we look at the book itself, we might come up with a more complicated answer, and there are other questions to ask as well, is that at the root of it, we are not rational, self-interested individuals. At the root of it, we are not what modernity and the project of modernity wanted us to be. And our attempts to move society and individuals toward this better version of a better humanity keeps on tripping up against the fact that we have all of that id inside us, all of that unconscious mind. And of course, we have the influence of the superego now too. Since the 1920s, he's recognized that all those other social influences around us. And this is keeping us or preventing us from realizing the great objectives of our lives. Freud is highly celebrated and recognized in his own day. In 1930, he wins the Goethe Prize. Kind of interesting, maybe ironic, that the man who wrote Faust gives us the kind of the myth of development, the tragedy of development too, is also the man who gives his name to the prize that Freud wins in 1930 as a testament to his recognition and its cultural importance in Germany. This is just 3 years before the Nazis come to power in Germany, and just 8 years before the Nazi annexation of Austria, which forces Freud to flee, of course, as a person of Jewish ethnicity, to London, where he spends the last year of his life. And that's one thing to think about, too, for this week, is how all of our authors, wherever they were, whatever they were doing, they end up running away to London. Orwell ends up in London. Tanya Alexander ends up in London. Sigmund Freud ends up in London. Now, sublimation, I've enlarged it there for you a bit, I think that was sort of the key to making sense of civilization and its discontents. And I want to, before we leave this behind, to call attention to, again, the question, why aren't we happy, and can the Soviet Union make humanity happy? When you're reading Freud, and I've sort of reduced the reading for you a bit. I've given you one chapter in particular to think about. Notice the roles of the two instinctual drives, eros and thanatos. Eros, right, the erotic, or from which we get the word erotic, is the binding force of the world, according to Freud. Thanatos, the aggressive or impulse or instinct that drives us to hate one another and drives us apart. There are forces in the world, says Freud, that pull us together, and there are forces that drive us apart. And one thing to notice, and this is how he's in conversation with people like Marx and Darwin and everybody else, and it's perhaps the most, for me, maybe the most eye-opening quotation, the shortest one also from the book, from chapter 5, when he claims that aggressiveness was not created by property. This is a stone in Marx's garden. It's a stone in the garden of a lot of the socialist thinkers who say the reason we haven't achieved the world we want is because of property relations. Freud says actually it's a lot deeper than that. Aggressiveness was not created by property. The hatred among people is not just a matter of distributing goods in an equal way. There are deep drives in us that compel us both to love and to hate, and that these would exist regardless of how egalitarian or how equally we've been able to divide up the world of property. I think I want to move on. I mean, this is a good quotation here, something we're thinking about. But what I would invite, I don't want to read this through or dwell on it right now, but I would just call attention to this really interesting argument that Freud makes here, again in chapter 5, about how it is that certain communities that are based upon the notion of being fundamentally true and fundamentally based on love, like the Christians, and then he says also the idea of the Germanic world, or the idea of Russia with its communist civilization, are uniquely inclined to hatred. That the Romans, who had not founded their communal life as a state upon love, as you see there, religious intolerance was something foreign, although with them religion was a concern for the state, and the state was permeated by religion. Back to the first sentence. When once the Apostle Paul had posited universal love between men as the foundation of his Christian community, extreme intolerance on the part of Christendom towards those who remained outside it became the inevitable consequence. The moment you say, we have love and we have a community of true believers here, you kind of create you do create a predicament in which all those who refuse to adopt the faith become deeply evil. And you historically have created a situation in which you have the right to exterminate them or to eliminate them because they have seen the light and they refuse to be made good by it. Freud is calling attention to an important dynamic, I think, in the way in which the stronger the claim we have for the good and for love in life, the stronger the contradictory claim for evil and for hatred and for, ultimately, for all the great genocides of the 20th century. He's trying to show how there's something that's common to the early Christians, to the Germans of the 1930s, and to the Russia under the Bolsheviks that was not common to the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans didn't care. They had a state religion, but they never declared themselves the one true faith. The ancient Romans declared themselves one faith. But the moment you have an ideology that says this is the right way to do things is the moment when you create the possibility to exterminate all those who refuse to agree with the right way to do things. The dehumanization of the enemy begins with the declaration of universal love, at least according to Freud. He wrote this in 1929, and it's worth sort of contemplating, I think, this last sentence. When he had seen this was the beginning of the 5-year plan, the great Stalinist terror had not yet happened, and he predicts it in 1929. He says, right now, in Russia, they need an enemy in order to create their socialist experiment. The communist civilization in Russia should find its psychological support in the persecution of the bourgeois. I wonder what will happen once they get rid of the bourgeoisie, says Freud, because they can't sustain themselves without somebody to hate. Who will they hate once they have eliminated the bourgeoisie? at least, and this is, of course, the moment when the Great Terror begins in Russia. We'll speak about that in the next lecture in 2 weeks. 1934 is basically the moment when Stalin declares the Soviet Union free of the bourgeoisie. The greatest violence in the Soviet Union begins at the moment they've eliminated the declared enemy. So in this way, I think Freud is a wonderful guide, at least to, you don't have to subscribe to his interpretation, but he offers at least an interpretation you can argue with and argue against and think through for how the violence of the 20th century took place and why the promises of modernity did not come to fruition, and how it might be that there's something deeper in the human psyche than just the question of Marxist property or the struggle of species, as Darwin is talking about. There might be something in the human individual, the other within. We might have something inside ourselves that is our own worst enemy. And each of us might have that inside of us. I want to turn now to the second part of this lecture, looking at our second major figure here, George Orwell. And if defamiliarizing development was the theme of the first part, as maybe the largest, the most important theme of modernity, the second most important theme of modernity we've been talking about so far is that of democracy. The notion of empowering the people collectively to make decisions for themselves, creating a form of government in which the voice of the people will actually matter. And this too, I would argue, gets defamiliarized in the 1920s and 30s. Just as Homo economicus is defamiliarized by Freud, by Keynes, by Trotsky, democracy and Homo politicus is defamiliarized first and foremost by Orwell. And the best place, I think, to see this is in the Spanish Civil War in Catalonia, on the battlefield for modernity's chosen people. George Orwell wrote in 1946, in his essay Politics and the English Language, this wonderful statement about the word democracy. Over the course of the last few decades, he claims democracy had kind of lost its meaning. Not only is there no agreed definition, but the attempt to make one is resisted from all sides. It is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are praising it. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime, whatever kind of regime, right, however totalitarian, claim that it is a democracy, and fear that they might have to stop using the word if it were tied down to one meaning. Orwell is simply calling attention to the defamiliarization of democracy. We've lost track of what this term means, or that the democracy has lost its clear value. George Orwell, born Eric Arthur Blair, who wrote under the pen name of Orwell, lived a much shorter life than Sigmund Freud, barely lived to be 47, and yet accomplished an enormous amount in that short lifetime. And like Freud, coined many of the most important words of the 20th century. Some of the big concepts we associate with him today include the Cold War itself. He's one of a few candidates for coining that term. The idea of a thought crime. Big Brother is watching you, the notion of the surveillance state somehow. The Ministry of Love, of course, as the doublethink. This notion that from 1984, that people are required to say one thing and do another, the hypocrisy of our everyday life. Double speak, newspeak, terms that have acquired a much wider cultural resonance and meaning than simply what they occupied in his writings. But in many ways, the most important work, at least for our, and certainly for our purposes, is Homage to Catalonia in 1938. And I just want to give you a sense of where this fits into his career. He was born in India, right, or in present-day India, present-day Bihar, British India. He was a child of colonial parents, and when he moved back to England, he wrote in 1937 The Return to Wigan Pier, kind of a celebration of the working class, of socialist struggle. He was very much a man who sympathized with the plight of the working man, the common man. And he had a very, you could say, clear vision of the world as one that needed to be transformed by modernity, made better. And the key thing that we needed to bring to the world through modernity was democracy. This quotation from I think this is a different version actually of page 48, probably doesn't apply for your copy, but from the Homage to Catalonia, I underline the word democracy just to alert you to how important this is for him in the larger narrative, in the larger argument. When the fighting broke out on the 18th of July, it is probable that every anti-fascist in Europe felt a thrill of hope. For here at last, apparently, was democracy standing up to fascism. But this is in some ways the simplistic view of the world, you could say, that with which he entered the fray of the Spanish Civil War. Two sides, democracy versus fascism. Everybody who believes in democracy has to join the one side. Let's make it happen. But his experience, and this is one reason why this is assigned in this course, of fighting in the Spanish Civil War, defamiliarizes democracy for him, defamiliarizes politics, defamiliarizes the whole promise of socialism to which he had committed himself from an early age. And it's after this experience that he writes his most famous works. I cited The Politics and the English Language as one of the first works where he really seems to have encountered and explored the problematic nature of the language with which we talk about our values. Animal Farm, of course, made him a global sensation, as did 1984, where most of his famous terms come from. But here we can take a moment just to look a bit at Orwell's encounter with Barcelona and with the Spanish Civil War, with Catalonia in particular. George Orwell is not unforgotten. In fact, we have the Plaza de George Orwell now in Barcelona commemorating his participation in the Spanish Civil War there. But to get a sense of the mood of his entry into Barcelona, it's worth reading just a few lines from the very beginning of his narrative. And you can see his socialist sympathies here. Right? It was the first time I had ever been at a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped by red flags or with the red and black flags of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with a hammer and sickle and with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burnt. Churches here and there were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks, right, the shoe shiners, had been collectivized and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shop walkers looked at you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said señor or don or even usted. Everybody called everyone else comrade and thou, and even said salud instead of buenos dias. Interspersed with a little bit of Spanish here, we have his first impressions of Barcelona, full of conventional socialist, maybe even communist symbolism, but as a world that has successfully become an egalitarian world, where people are treating one another as equals. The sense that the kind of world he wants to work with, the modern world, the democratic world where everybody is equal in their say, is on the brink of being achieved, if not already achieved. Now, the Spanish Civil War deserves a little bit of contextualization here too, and so we'll be focusing on the narrative and Orwell's argument in our discussion later. But I want to give you a sense of how the Spanish Civil War fits into this larger picture of Europe, just with two slides here. Because I think it's helpful to really get the most out of Orwell's own narrative. The key figure to know something about here is Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco was the youngest general Spanish general in history, and he was very unhappy in 1931 when the Second Spanish Republic overthrew the pre-existing monarchy. The Republic came to power, democracy was proclaimed. In the 1936 elections, a popular front emerged which saw the alliance of very diverse parties. You might be reminded of some of the earlier upheavals we saw in Europe, where very different ideological groups seem to find some kind of alliance or allegiance. Here, the Spanish Socialist Working Parties, it's an alphabet soup, you'll see, of all kinds of letters and numbers. There are only two that I'll ask you to really think about here. But the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, there was the Communist Party of Spain, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, the Republican Union Party, the Republican Left, the Catalan Nationalists, the Anarchist Trade Union. All of these groups are members of the same popular front. You have nationalists and communists working together here in the name of the Republic. The Republican Union Party, the Communist Party of Spain. And what's important to know about the Civil War and to notice about it is how it becomes the battleground for all of Europe. It's the kind of event that nobody can ignore. everybody has to take a side, or does take a side in the end. When Franco organizes his coup, basically, and overthrows the Republican government, initiating the Spanish Civil War, you're either on one side or the other. Most famously, Hitler and Mussolini come in to support Franco. At the same time, all the other countries of Europe, or let's say rather all the Republican countries of Europe, plus Stalin, comes in to support the Republic. These are strange bedfellows, people that don't quite make sense, but for understanding the politics, the geopolitics of the 1930s, it's worth remembering that Stalin is allied with France at this moment. That there's a network of European alliances which really declare there are only two sides. Which side you are on the Spanish Civil War? The Republic, together with the Catalan nationalists and the communists, or are you against the Republic, with Hitler and Mussolini and Franco? It's funny that for all that support, the Republic fails. Franco wins, becomes the dictator of Spain until his death in 1975, and Spain and Portugal remain these sort of parts of Europe that really seem to be caught in a time warp into the past long after World War II, because they sort of maintain all kinds of defunct forms of allegiance and power that have disappeared from the rest of Europe. But how is it that Franco manages to win this war against such a widespread opposition? And part of the answer, of course, is that opposition, or the Popular Front, they start fighting amongst themselves. And this is part of what to look for in Orwell, is how apparent friends seem to become enemies. Now, when Orwell enters the Civil War, he sees it as a battle between democracy and fascism. These are kind of propaganda posters in the spirit of World War I. You can see from both sides. And in the process, some 500,000 people are killed. You notice the posters here. Actually, in Spain, you have images of Lenin and Stalin actually on the buildings in Barcelona. Orwell describes the opposition as it appears quite eloquently here. He says, the right-wing version, this is the way, if you're on the right, this is how you see it. You see Christian patriots versus Bolsheviks dripping with blood. Or if you're on the left-wing version, it's gentlemanly Republicans quelling a military revolt. But this way of seeing this opposition, which is very similar to the way we talk about populism in Europe today, right now, covers up what's really important. And maybe it's important to think about how all our debates and discourse in this institute, too, about populism are maybe missing the point a little bit, if Orwell is right. There's something much deeper going on, says Orwell. For Orwell, he says, on some level, all of those who are fighting for the Republic, or at least there are several different groups that proclaim themselves to be socialists. Aren't we all socialists, he writes. There are two different groups that proclaim themselves to be socialists of two different types, the PSUC and the POUM, and these are the two groups I'd ask you to remember. The PSUC is the one supported by Stalin in Russia. The POUM is the anarchist socialist group supported by the Trotskyists in the Fourth International. Now, who hates? The greatest hates, as Freud tells us, come between people who originally seem to, well, on the basis of love. The groups and those who have been slighted in love, who have sort of fallen out of love, might be the biggest antagonists there are. In the end, and this is something to think about and try to figure out when you're reading the narrative, Orwell writes that in reality, it was the communists above all who prevented a revolution from happening in Spain. The communists called for revolution, and yet they seem to be the ones who prevent a revolution from happening there. If this is the defamiliarization of sort of 20th century contemporary politics, I don't know what is. But everything is turning into its opposite. In the 1930s in Spain, the communists are the anti-revolutionaries. The revolutionaries are completely different types of people. And we end up with a kind of antagonism on the left between the PSUC and the POUM, which is very hard to explain. I want to basically conclude this section by simply looking at one figure here and telling you a little bit, very briefly, his life story, because he is kind of the forgotten, you could say, figure at the center of the Spanish Civil War and at the antagonism among the different members of the Stalinist and the Trotskyist left. The strange death of the POUM founder, Andres Nin, sort of tells the story in microcosm. This was a poor man. He had a peasant mother, a shoemaker father. He came from pretty much nothing. But born in 1892, growing up in the shadow of the 1905 revolution, he believed in a better life, in becoming the subject and the object of his own development, one might say, getting an education, improving himself. And he became a journalist in Barcelona. He learned to read and write. Not everybody in his family would have in that day and age. And he founded, because he thought he saw a glimmer of hope in what was going on in Russia at the same time, the Communist Party of Spain, the PCE. He was so taken with this idea of creating an egalitarian society in which all people would be equal and be empowered by modernity that he in fact went to the USSR to work in the Comintern, in the Third International, at the time it was founded in 1917, to be educated in how to become a better subject and object of his own development, one might say. But in 1923, he decided he actually agreed more with Trotsky than with Stalin, and that he went to work for Trotsky's left opposition. Around this time, Trotsky got thrown out of the Soviet Union, and Andres Nin went back to Spain and decided he was going to found his own grassroots community organization to work for a better world, to accomplish those things which weren't being accomplished by the politicians in power and by the bureaucrats, which people had forgotten because they didn't care about each other enough anymore. And he was going to do that. He was going to be the man who would bring humanity back to politics. But he ran into a stumbling block in 1937 when the group that he founded, the POUM, which was fighting in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, against the fascists, against this authoritarian world order, was suddenly declared illegal by the PSUC, the other group of socialists, by the Stalinist ones. In 1937, he mysteriously died. He disappeared. And the question was, who had killed him? What happened to Andres Nin, this man who believed in making the world better? And it turned out he was a victim of the violence of the PSUC. The question that came to ring throughout Barcelona in 1937, ¿Dónde está Nin? Where is Nin? And the answer was always a joke, in Salamanca or in Berlin. He's either in Salamanca, in the capital of Franco, or in Berlin with Hitler. How was it that this man, who was on the side of changing the world in the name of Trotskyism, came to be associated by the PSUC with Hitler and with Franco? I think it speaks to the polarized nature of the world that I tried to introduce to you on the second slide of today's lecture. Thinking about how in the 1930s, the world became one in which you were it became very complicated on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was one where you were either for or against. And if you're against, you must be with our worst enemy. It was impossible to imagine a loyal opposition, somebody who might disagree with you on certain principal points, but agree with your larger cause. So this man who kind of wanted to work for socialism became identified with Hitler and with Franco, by the people who ultimately killed him. Orwell tells us a little bit about this in his narrative as well. The story of how the POUM became the main target of the PSUC. So the PSUC was no longer fighting Franco. The Spanish Civil War was no longer about the subjects which it seemed to be about at the beginning, but became about this conflict between two factions within the left. So if we have to explain why the Republicans lost the Civil War, part of the reason is the inability of the left to maintain a united front. And as a last gesture toward this theme of defamiliarization, I just want to point out to you how the strangeness of the enemies and the strangeness of the allies of this conflict. The POUM and the PSUC, both fighting for the Republic, both fighting against Hitler, both fighting against Franco, end up the greatest of enemies, and end up spending all of their resources trying to kill and destroy each other instead of thinking about this larger other conflict. And at the same time, France and the Soviet Union become the capitalist country of France and the socialist country of USSR become great allies in this conflict. Read chapter 5 about where Orwell tries to explain why it is and how it is that France and the USSR become allies, and how it is that this transforms the nature of the conflict into one that is profoundly anti-revolutionary for the Spaniards. One question to leave you with on that topic is, was the Spanish Civil War, what's the difference between a civil war and a revolution? Why wasn't the Spanish Civil War a revolution? This is something we can hold off for our discussion. For those of you who are helping to guide it, to lead it, you might think about that too. But this is a question that Orwell raises directly in his narrative. And it might help us think again more broadly about the place of war and revolution in modernity, and how modernity is made, how development and democracy are supposed to come to improve the world. So now we enter the final section of today's lecture, and maybe the longest section. Thankfully, we have a little bit more than half an hour to do this. But let me situate this last section for you in the context of what I've told you so far, just in case you've forgotten. So this lecture is all about the defamiliarization of modernity, I'll remind you. The idea that somehow in the 1920s and 30s, the promises of a better world are called into question, are placed in jeopardy, are become subject to criticism in a way that has never happened before. We looked at how the promise of development was challenged by the writings of Freud and by the economic developments of the 1920s and 30s, by the economic crash. Capitalism was called into question, and also how socialism became problematic with the divergence of Trotskyism and the Fourth International, and the Third International and Stalin and the Soviet Union on the other hand. And then we looked at how the ideal of democracy, which Orwell believed in more than anything else, was for Orwell himself called into question as he attempted to fight for the right side in the Spanish Civil War, and found that he was involved in a conflict where it seemed the people on his own side were more interested in fighting each other than they were in fighting the so-called enemy. In the third and final section of today's lecture, in some ways I want to address the problem of defamiliarization of modernity in its broadest possible sense. Not just development, not just democracy, but the ideal of the people themselves. And the idea of Europeans as kind of the goal of modernity is creating a new kind of people for Europe who will be empowered and able to guide us into the future through development and democracy. And I think we can see this best in another periphery of Europe. If the Spanish Civil War was our glance, or rather our investigation of Catalonia, of Barcelona, of Spain. Now looking at the part of Europe we're currently in Estonia, we find a refuge for some of Russia's former people. And I think the author, Tanya Alexander, gives us maybe the best possible access we can have to the problem of being a person in this part of the world in the interwar period. In the very first lines of her memoir, she notes, the Baltic philosopher Count Hermann Kaiserling, whose famous diary was written in 1914, once remarked, "I'm not a Dane, not a German, not a Swede, not a Russian, nor an Estonian. So what am I? A little of all these." I share his sense of confused identity. So Tanya Alexander then is telling us that she doesn't know exactly who she is. But maybe that's the human condition. Maybe this is our way of defamiliarizing humanity. It's not choosing a group, not finding a chosen people, but trying to accommodate and make sense of the diversity and the contradictory nature of the way people actually are. Her position in Estonia is important too. She's not an Estonian in Estonia, just the way Orwell's not a Spaniard in Spain. These are both, you could say, groups, members of a national group or an identity group that is foreign to the place where they are. And the 1920s and 30s are an important aid for moving around. But it forces us to question or ask, what will modernity do with all the people, the so-called former people, the people who are supposed to be left behind? If you think back to Goethe's Faust, of course, we have the old couple, Philemon and Baucis, who Faust has to remove in order to start developing the land. And in a similar way, you could say, peasants, aristocrats, and national minorities occupy the field of 1920s and 30s Europe. What will modernity do to them? They're not chosen people. They're people who are perhaps destined to be left behind. This phrase, the former people, comes from this 1897 short story by Maxim Gorky, who actually writes about them with a great affection and great love. And it's interesting that the term former people, it's a kind of a chilling word if you think about it. What does it mean to talk about a former person, a person who's no longer a person, right? When Stalin starts using the word, it becomes maybe one of the harshest sort of terms that he actually employs. But it's a way of justifying, of course, violence towards people you think of as enemies of your project and your state. But this problem of the former people and the chosen people, I would say, is a really helpful one for thinking through what goes wrong with modernity in the bigger sense, and why this question of making the people is so problematic. I've listed here three different candidates for who the former people are according to various ideologies. According to Marx, the peasants are former people. Remember, the peasants are the ones who have to disappear. They're no more consciousness than potatoes in a sack. They don't know who they are. They don't know what they want. We have to get rid of them to make room for the proletariat so that the working people can truly realize their own objectives as the chosen people. National minorities are these people who are living in the newly created nation states of Europe but aren't members of the titular nation. The League of Nations recognized this. It would be a situation, wanted to create rules to help accommodate them, but everybody saw this as kind of a problem. What do you do with the French who are living in Germany, with the Germans who are living in Estonia, with the Russians who are living in Latvia? Do you force them to leave? Do you tell them to assimilate? Do they have to change themselves? This is a big problem, a big question, in a world that's based upon nation states. And all these ideologies, of course, have a vision of the people who have to disappear and the people who have to become more powerful. In capitalism, or in most of the, say, the non-socialist world, it's really the bourgeoisie, it's the middle class, who is sort of celebrated as the chosen people, the people who get to feel the most proud of themselves and the most, as if they are the ones contributing the most to society. Let's not kid ourselves that we think in these terms too. It's not just other extreme regimes that do this. All regimes, on some level, think about some people as having more value than others. The homeless person sleeping on the side of the road doesn't have as much value, according to most of these ideologies, as the person who has a job, has work, and is contributing to society. But what we see as meaningful contribution, that differs from one ideology and one society to the other. The bourgeoisie is a hard concept. Sometimes, right, according to some ideologies, they are chosen people. According to socialism, the bourgeoisie are supposed to be members of the former people. So where do they in fact belong? I want to give you the language of former and chosen peoples becomes very intense in the 1930s. Some very respected Englishmen who you would think would be so civilized that they would not speak in these terms or in this say some of the cruelest and the harshest things you can possibly imagine. And one person who does this is the lifelong Fabian socialist George Bernard Shaw, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1925, author of Man and Superman, Major Barbara, and Pygmalion, which became the famous Broadway musical My Fair Lady. Listen to what he has to say about the parasites in society.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put them there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
What I want to do with this, I want to in some ways defamiliarize for you polite politics with this quote. There's nobody who is more part of the polite politics of the era than George Bernard Shaw. And yet the kinds of things he's saying here are probably much more extreme than anything that Hitler or Stalin is writing at the same time. We have to figure out who is of use to society, cost-benefit analysis. We can't use the organization of society for keeping you alive if you're not pulling more than your weight. So we might need to eliminate you. Very politely said, but the implication is striking. Now, the point is not just to think back on the 30s, oh, what a horrible time, they really did not get it. But rather, to think about how common this way of thinking was in the 1930s. How basically everybody participated in it. In many ways, I want to set up my lecture on Hitler and Stalin, which will be the last lecture of the second part of the course in 2 weeks, with this lecture today, to help us to think about how Hitler and Stalin don't come from nowhere. They come from a set of sensibilities that are almost universal in Europe at the time. They're as present in England as they are elsewhere. Keynes, as you remember, was the head of the eugenic society of England up until Second World War. There was nothing bad seen about talking about genetic manipulations or about genetic engineering. It was par for the course. Every society had one of these, Swedes, the Americans. It was only after the Holocaust and after the Second World War that we start to see things in the way that we see them now. But up until the Second World War, most societies are open to this idea that there are parasites in society. And the question is how to identify them. How to identify those people who don't deserve to live, who don't deserve a place in the social game. Are they the aristocrats? Are they the poor? Are they the bourgeoisie, like the bankers? Maybe are they national minorities? Of course, we all know who Hitler's sort of former people are, the Jews. National minorities, policy in national minorities as a problem is institutionalized in the League of Nations, international laws for minority protection. Of course, the great transformation wrought by the First World War was the transformation of Europe based on empires and dynastic loyalties into a Europe based upon national loyalties. In the past, you owed your allegiance to the emperor, whatever his nationality. Catherine the Great, Russia, remember, she's German, but she's ruling Russia. Lots of these kinds of situations. It doesn't matter what the nation is. What matters is your commitment to the dynasty. In the world of the nation states of the post-World War I era, national integrity, national purpose become a major theme, and along with them, every country acquires its national minorities. And across the 1930s, almost every country in Eastern Europe, and actually throughout most of Europe, undergoes some kind of right-wing dictatorial turn, where the democracy that's been created, according by the League of Nations mandates, turns into a form of authoritarian rule. Happens first in Italy. In 1922, Mussolini takes power and basically starts fascism. In Poland, I'm not going to go through all of them, just a few examples here. Poland, it's 1926. Pilsudski takes power and basically declares martial law. In Germany, in 1933, Hitler takes power. In Spain, which we looked at already, the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936. Franco attacks the Second Spanish Republic and becomes the great dictator for life, basically. And in Estonia, where we are right now, in 1934, the moment is 1934, when President Konstantin Pets suspends the constitution and ends freedom of speech, and basically undertakes the similar kind of turn towards the right. We're left with this question of how to think about Europe in the interwar period. And in the part 2 of this lecture, I invited you to think about Europe as a battleground, a place where various individuals and groups fight about the right form of Europe and the right form of chosen people. But there's another way of thinking about Europe in this period, which Tanya Alexander's narrative and the predicament of Estonia after the 1930s helps us see. And this is the idea of Europe as a refuge. Because even after 1934, even after President Betts suspends the Constitution, ends the freedom of speech, he doesn't actually change one really important thing that makes it possible for Titania to stay here and to live here and to actually do quite well here up until the 1939 or 40 or whenever she leaves. The interwar Estonian National Republic had one really important and interesting law that actually has made it into a lot of international history or politics sort of books. And this is the Cultural Autonomy Law of 1925. This was a kind of law that was supposed to exist in all of the European countries after the First World War, but wasn't particularly successfully implemented in most places. And in many ways, you could say the reason for its successful implementation in Estonia did not have anything to do with people's greater broad-mindedness, but actually perhaps the more embattled position of the Estonian majority. In Estonia, national minorities with a population of 3,000 or more could apply for special status as national minorities. And the 4 groups that did this successfully were Germans, Russians, Swedes, and Jews. In other words, they petitioned the government for the right to found their own schools in their own language, for the right to engage in correspondence with the government in their own language, to create their own, to some extent, court system for the people, members of this community, for basically their right to exist as a sub-community, as a national minority within the National Republic. When you're reading Tanya Alexander's memoir, the thing to remember is that she is one of these national minorities. And she's living, as she puts it, in the context of this bubble created by the national minorities laws. Our school at Wesenberg was one of the German-speaking minority schools, she says. The Ritterschaft, that is the knightly orders, had been responsible for its finances. With the establishment of Estonian independence, the cultural freedom of the minority schools was guaranteed. As a consequence, the government was well disposed to German-speaking schools, which continued to maintain their high standards. So she is living, actually, even after the dictatorial turn of 1934, it ends freedom of speech, basically, in the Estonian language. But it doesn't really prevent these national minorities from continuing to exist in their separate bubbles, and they keep their funding, basically. Tanya is an interesting example, right? She has a Baltic German father, Ukrainian and Russian-speaking mother. Who is she? She's divided in her person, and she identifies more with her Russian self, even though she's at this German school. There are multiple layers of nationality going on here in her experience and in her identity. And I think one way to read her memoir and to think about her memoir is precisely in contrast to Orwell's memoir and writings about Spain. Orwell's talking about a battleground where people are fighting all the time about what Europe should be. Estonia for her, and this lake that she talks about here, Kaljärv, and it's a refuge. It's a way of getting away, escaping from all of these conflicts and these questions about who you are and who you are supposed to be. It's not to say this is a perfectly peaceful, idyllic place. It is in some ways, it isn't in others. Her father shot dead on the edge of his estate in 1918 apparently probably Estonian peasants sort of rising up in the day of establishing a new Estonian state. It's not a place without violence, but it is a place that has a very different feel to it and a very different dynamic from Barcelona or from Catalonia. And my point in emphasizing this to you is that I think there were a lot of these kinds of pockets around Europe at the same time. And when we're thinking about what kind of Europe we want, is it this Europe, or is it the kind of Catalonia Europe? Both existed at the same time in the 1930s. And we could try to find our ideals of Europe in either or both of these places. Now, the story that Tanya Alexander is telling is not just her own story, but it's the story of her mother. And it would be important when we talk about this next week, and for those who present, to actually somehow distinguish between these two stories, because her mother is a very different person from herself. Her mother is very much connected to the wider world of politics, to the wider world of high society. If you haven't noticed it yet, I just want to point out some of her connections here. Here is a picture of her and her husband. These are Tanya's parents in Berlin, presumably before the revolution. But Mora, or her mother, Maria Ignatievna Zakharevskaya, or also known as the Countess Beckendorf, Baroness Budberg, was connected to a lot of very influential people. Many of these are presented by her daughter, at least, as her various lovers or her various sort of paramours. But through them, she becomes an important player in European and Soviet politics. Robert Lockhart is probably her big sort of love here. In 1887, the person with whom she tries to get involved, born in 1887, but the person with whom she tries to get involved in the Russian Revolution. Later, she becomes involved with or is connected to Maxim Gorky, the founder of really the literary establishment in the Soviet Union, the author of Former People. And if you read the chapters I've assigned, Tanya's telling you a story of a lot of these different people. Through her eyes and through her experience of her mother, she meets H.G. Wells. She meets Maxim Gorky. H.G. Wells was the next one, right? Gorky and H.G. Wells are kind of competing for more sort of attention. But it's a way in which the Western world and the kind of the Soviet world get brought together in a very intimate way. Later, the head of the Soviet secret police, Yagoda, is another one of Mora's sort of associates here. He's standing next to a much older version of Gorky there. And later on, figures like the writer Graham Greene and the actor, sort of director Laurence Olivier, are all kind of buzzing around Mora at various times. And through her figure, I mean, if nothing else, she creates this network of connection. And one thing to think about through her story, the story that Tanya tells of her, is how personal geopolitics actually is. We think about treaties, people making decisions behind closed doors, but actually a lot personal sympathies, personal loves, personal hatreds play their own role as well. And this is one of the few kind of sources in which we can see this happening. Her story was turned into a Hollywood film in 1936 on the basis of her of Robert Bruce Lockhart's memoir. I don't want to. It's a terrible movie. I'm not going to. But I wonder if I should play a little bit of this. But a question arises: how should we think of her? Because she, in some level, became a double agent. She was working for both the English and the Soviets. She spoke Russian, of course. She was kind of not politically connected in a very profound way. She didn't have strong beliefs, but personally she became very involved. And the most famous thing that she became involved in early on was the 1918 Lockhart plot, a failed assassination attempt of Lenin. If it had succeeded, of course, Lenin would have been dead and the revolution would have been nipped in the bud. But it didn't work out that way. Okay, now this.
What, for instance?
Well, for instance, the moon,
I don't think so.
stars,
No?
music,
No?
us,
No.
yes.
You do awfully well for a man whose hands are tied.
I do even better for a man who's only known you an hour.
And I'll see you next Tuesday. What are you doing?
Catching up for next Tuesday.
You're mad.
Forgotten stars of the.
This Englishman, Locke.
Yes?
We have reason to believe that he's supporting the White Revolt.
And what you need is a scapegoat.
I need sufficient evidence to arrest him, and you must help me to get it. I'll give you the check.
I can't do it, Sergei.
You must. You realize that if he's arrested now, he will only be deported. Later, he will be shot.
Medal. Where is he?
Okay, that gives you a taste of it. I'm afraid I'm going to have to nip it in the bud. It doesn't get any better. But it did become, in the 1930s already, this sufficiently famous story to be turned into a Hollywood film. And so even provincial Estonia and the mother, the ever-absent mother of Tanya, becomes sort of a figure of international importance. Robert Bruce Lockhart, who was involved in the plot and whose version of the story is the one turned into the movie. You're reading the story written from the women's perspective instead. Was a good friend of an associate of Sidney Riley. You might know, perhaps you know who Sidney Riley was? Another important British agent, more famously known as the basis for James Bond, yeah. Okay, so the James Bond story starts here as well. But later on, I just want to point out this one kind of quote from the daughter Tanya about her mother, which reminds us of the danger that Mora faced living in Estonia in the 1930s. The danger of becoming a former person, of disappearing from the world, of sort of being forgotten. Mora was determined, she wrote, not to be among those of her generation who were destroyed by the war, revolution, and the poverty of an emigre existence. She might not have believed very deeply in the political agenda of transforming the world, which might have made her a better agent than some of the others. But she was determined to find a place for her in a world that declared that there was no place for her in it. One of the people that she's also connected to here, and we hear about a lot, is the writer Maxim Gorky, the author of Former People, and actually quite a well-respected Russian writer even before the revolution. Here we have Gorky and Tolstoy, Gorky and Chekhov. The picture on the right, I took myself from Gorky's mansion in Moscow. This was basically the gilded cage, Art Nouveau architecture that Stalin gave to Gorky when he invited him back to become the head of the writers' establishment in. See the lizard-encrusted capital on the pillar, the flowing forms, stone looking like water of the balustrade. It's an amazingly kind of impressive house full of windows like this, but it was a place where maybe Gorky felt like he was in prison. And it was here that Stalin actually declared the new policy of literature in the Soviet Union, the making of socialist realism. On October 26, 1932, Stalin raised a toast at the home of Maxim Gorky to writers, claiming that the production of souls is more important than the production of tanks, and therefore I raise my glass to you, writers, the engineers of the human soul. Gorky's position wedged here between Stalin on the right and Voroshilov, so the head of the Soviet military, on the left, speaks to the place of literature, you could say, in the Soviet Union, kind of watching out on both sides. And this is taken in the same house. But I want to draw to a conclusion today simply by looking at maybe the end of this tale of defamiliarization. First, I want to remind you of where we've come. Talked about defamiliarization as something, as an important concept in art that we can apply to the transformations in economics and politics and society in the 1930s. And that many of the great thinkers of this period are great precisely because they apply some form of defamiliarization to making sense of where the world is going. Not everybody gives up on the promise of modernity. And in many ways, the Soviets remain committed to that. And the commitment to that vision of modernity is expressed in the world of literature and the world of art as socialist realism. And nobody is more important to the making of socialist realism than Maxim Gorky himself, who you will recognize more as, or rather, Tanya Alexander's memoir, as the sort of the loving old uncle in Sorrento in Italy, sort of playing games with his children and his children's children. But as a fighter for the revolution, we might talk about where the dominant form of Soviet literature, Soviet art comes from that is supposed to still be committed to transforming the world, that overcoming defamiliarization, a world refamiliarized perhaps. For that, the work we'll be discussing this Friday is useful. Trotsky's Literature and Revolution is probably the first important work to come out of the Soviet canon to try to make sense of the place of literature in the Soviet experiment. And in it, Trotsky calls for a new kind of literature, but he doesn't tell us exactly what it's supposed to be like. That becomes Gorky's establishment. The one thing Trotsky tells us is that building socialism requires art, that art is important. And of course, Stalin subscribes to that idea too when he says that building, that writers are more important, and literature, writing works of literature is more important than producing tanks or building military equipment. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union starts producing production novels, these novels about building a new future, a new life, quite kind of, you could say, very proletarian novels about working class conditions and working class work. In 1928, Gorky is brought back to the USSR from Europe. It's right before this, of course, that Gorky meets Tanya Alexander in Italy. But when he's brought back, he's moved into that apartment we looked at before, that sort of mansion. And he's asked to start thinking about and developing the new literary system, the new aesthetic system for the Soviet Union. In 1932, he founds the Soviet Writers' Union. In 1933, he publishes the article, Socialist Realism, which defines what this new kind of vision of art is going to be about. And in 1934, he calls the first all-Union Congress of Writers. All the different national writers of the Soviet Union, the various national republics, are called to gather in Moscow and to think about what then socialist realism means for Azerbaijan, for Armenia, for Kazakhstan, for Ukraine. Gorky's coordinating all of this. So the question remains, what was socialist realism? How was it supposed to be different from any other kind of realism? How was it supposed to return Russia and Europe and the Soviet Union to a path of modernity and development, to rescue it from the dangers of excessive defamiliarization that would make us question everything and forget where we are headed? Gorky decided that, or one way to think about it, independent of Gorky actually, is that we can think about socialist realism in two ways. As an aesthetic, as a way of representing the world, but also as a master plot. One of the most famous books about socialist realism by Katerina Clark, called The Soviet Novel, is really about this master plot, about the story that animates all of the literary undertakings of the Soviet Union, really partly through Gorky's initiative, but since the 1934. And the thing to notice or recognize about socialist realism, and why it's not defamiliarizing, but it's refamiliarizing, is that it's supposed to give us hope for the future. Give us hope not by depicting life as it is now, not by showing us what we have, but showing us instead life in the process of being transformed by socialism. Socialist realism is supposed to be a very future-oriented kind of art. It can show hardship, it can show suffering. It doesn't have to show everything beautiful and shiny and good. But it has to show the striving for a better life and the belief in the achievement or accomplishment of that life. Life in the process of being transformed, redeeming present suffering by the promise of future social achievements. This is basically what socialist realism, as Gorky defined it, and as Gorky tried to develop it, was. Last slide of today's lecture. Want to bring us back in some ways to our connection with Europe. But start where we just ended. With the Soviet Union of Writers, founded in Moscow in 1932 by the Committee of the Communist Party, Central Committee of the Communist Party. The idea here, of course, is to have a national union for each Soviet republic. The official newspaper, the Literary Gazeta, proclaims socialist realism and works on developing it. In the meantime, in Western Europe, an organization is also emerging, which I would invite you to think about for its similarities to the Soviet Union of Writers. The International Organization for Poets, Essayists, and Novelists, or PEN, was founded in London in 1921. And in its mission statement is the claim, literature knows no frontiers and must remain common currency among people in spite of political or international upheavals. Mutual respect between nations, unhampered transmission of thought within each nation and between all nations is its highest objective. In 1934 in Moscow, the head of PEN, H.G. Wells, and the head of the Soviet Union of Writers, Maxim Gorky, met. Here is Morel Budberg between them. But basically, we here have the encounter of European literature and Soviet literature brought together under the aegis of Stalin to think about how they're both committed to the idea of internationalism and nationalism at the same time, bringing together different nations. The language of internationalism and nationalism exists in both. Over respecting every nation, but overcoming that national boundary in order to have a literature that unites us with all of humanity. And the leaders or the heads of these associations briefly in a friendly kind of conversation here. And I'll leave you finally just with Tanya Alexander's own comment upon Gorky. If the leaders in Russia were like Gorky and thought like him, this self-taught man who had fought so hard for a new Russia, then I felt that there must be much that was good in communism. When we focus not on the ideologies, but on the people involved and how those people play a role, an unpredictable and unexpected role often in other people's lives, we see the developments of modernity in a defamiliarized sense. And perhaps we see good in what we formerly thought was only evil, and a little bit of evil of what we formerly thought was only good. And we recognize, as Sigmund Freud wanted us to see, the other within, and also the friend in the other. I think I'll leave you there. Thank you.